are doing well. Today, we are going to be presenting our project we would have given to a conservative group trying to address issues on climate change. Our initial project focused on carbon pricing, but afterwards we moved towards trying to figure out what resonates with conservative groups. We give a few pointers that we found resonate with those groups, and at the end, give some tips on how you yourself can make one of these presentations and really tailor it to the specific group you're looking at. I hope you.
All right, economic impacts of climate change. So obviously climate change would have a huge impact on US agriculture. It'd have an impact on mortality, crime, energy use, and storm activity, which obviously affects the economy. If there's 2 degrees Celsius warming by 2080, they expect there to be a 0.5% decrease in GDP annually. And with a 4 degrees Celsius warming by 2080, they expect a 2% decrease in GDP annually. Currently, there's 2 million homes at risk of being underwater. This is disproportionately in the South, and obviously, like many things, it will disproportionately affect the poor. In general, there's an increased risk in the economy overall, not just in the United States, but internationally. Businesses will be disrupted, assets will be destroyed, there's going to be migration, there's going to be destabilized countries, and obviously, there's credit and market losses that result from that. Within all that, there are economic growth opportunities. As we've studied, two-thirds of renewables are cheaper than carbon-based energy, and that's a result of technology improving. Carbon-based models also allow the market to determine the cheapest source. Alternatives like government regulation are typically more expensive for businesses. So carbon price typically leads to the incentivization of cheaper technologies being developed. And typically it's a lot cheaper than allowing the governments to decide which regulations to impose. So the way that works is essentially by allowing corporations to have their sort of self-interest in meeting their bottom line, they might have a better insight as to which technologies lower their carbon footprint, whereas the government might not have that expertise. There's also opportunities for sustainably linked financing, and there may be $2.1 trillion worth of new growth prospects. So that's investing in green infrastructure and public transit, coastal infrastructure, electric vehicles, renewable energy, etc. Pessimistically, there are some other economic benefits that could be gained by increasing climate change. For instance, AC use will increase, Arctic shipping lanes will be available, pharmaceuticals will have more demand, and with geopolitical instability, there might be more benefits to the military industrial complex. But nonetheless, there's also plenty of benefits to investing in sustainable development and combating climate change.
Hello, my name is Naira, and I'm going to talk to you today about the scientific progress that has been made to solve the CO2 emissions problem and help with the climate change issues. So, there are two techniques that I found interesting, which are carbon mineralization and zero carbon factories. So, for carbon mineralization, it is a technique where the CO2 is captured and then it is stored in other minerals, and when the CO2 and these minerals or materials react, they could produce building material, and we can see the list of equations right here. There are also zero carbon factories, and I have a video clip about them. So this automated factory in Morocco has reduced 98% of the carbon emissions and reduced 70% of the water consumption. So what it did was use biomass, and it was also use the water discharges, like reuse them through a pipeline system. So this way the carbon emissions and the water consumption has been reduced greatly. There is also, like I said, the video clip that shows how the factory works and everything. And that's it. Thank you.
Dina.
So something that we looked at that was really interesting and really important was the impact of climate change on the local community, and it's really important to present that information. So your people are aware of how important this issue is to where they are. And we know that climate change disproportionately affects poor communities and poor individuals. And looking at the community where we are, we see that Rochester has about a 33% poverty rate. So we have to acknowledge that there's an inevitable connection there between, climate change and even where we go to school, and realizing that things such as like air quality and food and water supply, and shelter, those things are all affected, and it sort of perpetuate poverty. So really acknowledging that and the connection there was a really cool thing to learn about and really important thing to present. And it was also really, really interesting to learn about the appeal to humanity and the human side of things, because this has largely become a partisan issue somehow, even though it really isn't. But remembering that the only criteria you need to care about the environment is to live on Earth, because, it's what we all have in common, it's our home. And seeing that we all have a connection to the problem, no matter who we are or what we believe in, we all have a connection. So finding those connections, whether it be activities we like or where we live or people we know, finding those connections and realize we all have a stake in the game. And really knowing that caring about the environment is caring about humankind. It's all connected. And, that was a really important thing to learn about and a really important way to present things. It might be a unique perspective because it's less about science and it's less about the numbers. But it really does get the point across because we all have hearts. And
for my part of the presentation, I focused on how to educate these different deniers and conservative groups on issues of climate change. And within my research, I found a lot of the time climate change and religion are heavily intertwined. So I wanted to make the point that when you are presenting to these groups, it's really important to stay away from theology and to really focus on what individual values those groups have. And that's where we come to connecting the dots. I read 2 studies that looked at what makes conservative groups want to change their actions towards climate change. And it's important to note, I'm not trying to change the opinion of these groups, but rather their actions. And the 2 biggest things that people identify with is they want a society that is considerate and caring, and they also want a society that's working towards improving technological and economic advancements. And we talked a lot about some of the latter points in this presentation. Lastly, I looked at clear-cut tips in terms of presenting to these groups. Out of this list that you can read, the last one really resonated with me, and it's looking at different personnel such as military personnel, business leaders, conservative leaders that can convey those climate change messages to their followers. Lastly, I'd like to thank you all for tuning into our presentation, and I hope everyone has a great summer break.